Good day, everyone, and thank you, UTA College of Engineering, for hosting this event. My name is Klaus Schroeder, a PhD student in the Civil Engineering Department. Today, I'm presenting a holistic approach for physical, economic, and socio-demographic evaluation of coastal flood hazard adaptation in Santa Monica Bay, California, that our team, Dr. Hummel, Dr. Rufus, and myself have been working on. This approach seeks to translate the hydrodynamic implication of coastal adaptation strategies into potential costs and benefit to the relevant coastal communities. Sea level rise and increased coastal flooding as a result of climate change poses a threat to coastal communities worldwide. In response to these threats and the associated unintended consequences of grey infrastructure to mitigate coastal flooding and the negative environmental impacts associated with them, the use of natural and nature-based features has become increasingly popular. The potential flood reduction as well as the associated economic benefits of these approaches have warranted further investigation. Our research focuses on the densely developed and low-lying Marina del Rey, Venice Beach and Venice Canals area in Southern California. The figure on the left shows the extent of projected flooding in our case study area without any adaptation strategies for 3 sea level rise scenarios as modeled by the USGS. The blue representing flooding extent under no sea level rise scenario, the orange being 0.5 meters sea level rise, and the red a 1.54 meter scenario with extensive flooding around Marina del Rey and the Venice canals. Impacts of previous extreme winter wave events have led to various projects to mitigate coastal flooding, as shown in the figures on the right. With the threat of sea level rise and increased storm intensity, our goal here was to consider the effectiveness of a range of coastal adaptation options to address issues related to coastal flooding and to evaluate their relative local and regional economic and socio-demographic impacts. This is a brief overview of the process that we are applying, starting with stakeholder engagement and then using a modeling approach to understand patterns of flooding, economic damages, and socio-demographic impacts. Given that information, we then evaluate different adaptation alternatives and iterate through additional stakeholder engagement to select adaptation alternatives that meet the goals and satisfies the priorities of stakeholders. Our work utilizes and builds upon the existing hydrodynamic modeling framework developed by the USGS called the Coastal Storm Modeling System, more commonly referred to as COSMOS. In summary, the model allows assessments of future coastal flooding exposure by dynamically modeling sea level rise, water levels, and coastal change. For this study, the adaptation strategies that we focused on consisted of engineered adaptation strategies, nature-based approaches, and hybrid alternatives that combine the sluice-gate strategies with the nature-based approaches. We estimated the economic cost and benefits of certain coastal adaptation strategies by applying FEMA's Flood Assessment Structure tool, abbreviated as FAST, and obtaining the total flood damage cost. For comparing adaptation strategies, these losses are then summed together to obtain the total residential and non-residential flood damage cost for each scenario and adaptation configuration. In a nutshell, FAST is an open source tool that calculates building level flood impacts with user-provided building and flood depth data. An example of this data is shown on the top right figure, with the orange dots being building stock data and the blue area our flood depth data. The program assigns depth damage functions to buildings according to specific building attributes. Flood depth is then extracted at every building and used as depth damage function parameter to calculate estimated costs pertaining to building loss, content loss, and inventory loss. We use FEMA's hazard demographic information developed from 2010 census data stored in SQL tables in congruence with hazard flood modeling techniques to estimate the total number of people affected by different coastal flood events and adaptation strategies for multiple socio-demographic categories. This is done by assessing the percent of flooding found at each census block and then applying that percentage to each socio-demographic category within the census block. Results from our study show that from a regional perspective, all adaptation strategies contributed somewhat to reducing flood impacts, with all impacts being below 100% of the no action scenarios impacts. Furthermore, strategies that include the sluice gate reduce economic damages the most. However, for other attributes, its performance is reduced, especially during increased storm intensities. From a local perspective, the inclusion of a sea gate reduces strategies' performance across all attributes. By itself, the sluice gate exacerbates flooding in Venice canals. So in conclusion, we found that dual approaches that provide protection along beaches and inlets perform best at reducing or eliminating flooding, damages, and population impacts at regional level. The location of adaptation installments affect flood flow patterns and can exacerbate flooding elsewhere, leading to unintended impacts on residents and therefore should be carefully considered. Results indicate trade-offs between economic and social risk reduction priorities. And finally, this approach allows for a comprehensive evaluation of coastal protection alternatives across multiple objectives consistent with stakeholder priorities. That is it from me for today. Thank you for listening.